Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm John Miller, and this is How the Hell Did We Get Here? A U.S. history podcast. This is part 2 of an episode that I have already done part 1 of. I learned sort of the hard way, the last episode I recorded, that sometimes I may go a little long and that these need to be broken up. So I am just going to do that preemptively this time around. In part 1 of this episode, this 2-part episode, I covered the first of the 3 questions that I asked, which is, again, how did the English Civil War, the Stuart Restoration, and English pursuit of mercantilism unfold and affect English colonization of the New World? And I talked about, in this case, the Dominion of New England was the third piece that I covered, and that does have to do with the 2 questions I'm going to get to in this part of the episode, which are, again, question 2, how did King Philip's War, Bacon's Rebellion, and the Dominion of New England, as I just mentioned, fundamentally alter the social, economic, and political trajectories of the British North American colonies from 1675 to 1750. I'll say that one more time. How did King Philip's War, Bacon's Rebellion, and the Dominion of New England fundamentally alter the social, economic, and political trajectories of the British North American colonies from 1675 to 1750? And again, I talked about the Dominion of New England in the first part of this episode, so if you want to hear that part, you just got to back up and listen to that part. I'm also going to cover the third question, which again is, how did salutary neglect, immigration, economic trends, and religion combine to create a uniquely American character? Which is something that you start to see in this period, that people in the colonies are becoming something other than English. They're becoming American, effectively. And I went through the books that I used, as I usually do at the beginning of the first part of the last episode. If you want to see those, of course, they're there. I always want to share with you guys where I get my information, or at least reinforce the information, so you can, of course, check that out at your convenience, and I'd recommend that you do. So, I'm going to start this one with populist uprisings and wars with Native Americans. Now, I had mentioned in previous episodes that the relationship between Native Americans and English settlers of North America wasn't always great, and in fact was often really bad. There are occasions in which it starts off peaceably and relatively amicably. However, those relationships largely go sideways between Native Americans and Europeans, because Europeans really fail to respect Native American culture, land control, and the decades and centuries of civilization that Native Americans had built in these places. As I discussed in the previous episode, when I talked about how the English settled Ireland and how they would use that eventually as a model for what they would do in North America, the English saw Native Americans in the way that English people largely saw the Irish, which is that they were barbarous heathens, they were in the way, they were regressive, they were not making the most of their land that they had control of, and so the English felt justified in pushing them out of the way, or out and out killing them by the thousands. It really starts in this period with what is called King Philip's War in 1675-76. It is initially launched by the Wampanoag Confederacy, and that includes a few other tribes that the Wampanoag Confederacy managed to convince to ally with them. And it's largely because in what is now New England, the natives were being pushed and pushed and pushed out of the way by a stream of colonists who came, initially in the 1620s, 30s, 40s, before the English Civil War took place. And then there was another big migration of people out of England into North America following the conclusion of the English Civil War following the Stuart Restoration in 1660. For a period, the immigration to New England, particularly of Puritans, stopped, but then it picked right back up again. And so there's this flood of people that are coming over, and they're just expanding further and further westward away from the Atlantic Ocean and into Native American territory. And they're signing these agreements and continually refusing to respect them. Okay? And Native Americans start to feel as though they don't really have a choice but to make their displeasure known by an attack and to band together to stop their complete displacement from territory that they have lived in for, in many cases, centuries. All of this displacement is what leads to the attack on English settlers in 1675. The Native American Confederacy launches this attack, and nearly half of New England's towns are attacked in this period. 12 in Massachusetts are totally destroyed. So it is a pretty devastating event from the perspective of colonists in New England. But again, from the perspective of Native Americans, they're sort of backed against a wall and feel like they don't have a choice, because every time they try to reach some kind of accommodation with white settlers in New England, it doesn't seem to last, and they lose more and more land. In mid-1676, just as things are still going really badly for the English and other European settlers in New England, the Mohawk Nation decides to join forces with the English settlers. Okay? And the Mohawks are a tribe that they're in upstate New York. They are part of the Iroquois Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And they see an advantage in allying themselves with these European descended or European settlers. And that's generally how these things work, is that Europeans and various groups of Europeans and various groups of Native Americans, the alliances are fluid. They kind of change pretty rapidly in some cases, really depending on what the people involved feel is best for them and their circumstances. And the Mohawks decided at this point that they were better served by allying themselves with English people over other native tribes and pushing back against the Confederacy of Native Tribes in New England. So that's a turning point. From that point forward, the Wampanoag Confederacy and its allies loses its advantage, and they are defeated. Metacom, who is the eponymous King Philip, it's not really what his people called him. They called him Metacom. The Whiteys called him King Philip, probably because they just didn't understand Metacom. I'm not entirely sure why, if I'm being honest. Metacom is executed, and numerous native towns and villages are destroyed. Thousands of men, women, and children are killed or sold into slavery. And this is, again, kind of the pattern that you see. There is a native attack for a while. There's maybe an advantage, and sometimes it's not always the natives that attack first, but very often they try to do that to get some sort of advantage. They are eventually overwhelmed by the English forces or the European descended forces, and there's a brutal reprisal. I already talked about this a little bit when I talked about Jamestown and the attacks of the 1620s that then resulted in a decade of brutal reprisals by Virginians, and ultimately a treaty of 1646 that forced the Native Americans to give up a bunch of land along the James River and into the interior of Virginia. So that's what happens here. Natives are permanently weakened in New England. They really don't pose a significant threat to Europeans after this is over. In Virginia, there is something somewhat similar, although the dynamics are a little bit different. And as we've discussed in previous episodes, the settlement patterns in Virginia and the South in general are different than in New England. In New England, it's a lot of towns and villages and families and small plots of land. In the South, it's more single men and large plantations and big plots of land and people looking to become large-scale farmers, plantation owners, okay? And a lot more indentured servants are coming to Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, than would go to New England or the middle colonies. Although, I mean, there's still indentured servants in those places, just it's not nearly as big a percentage of the population as in the South. And as we discussed with these indentured servants, they are poor people in Europe and England who are looking to better their economic situation from a place in England or in some other part of Europe where they probably don't have a realistic opportunity to own land, to become a farmer, whatever. These folks can go to North America and they have a much better opportunity to own land there than they would back in Europe. However, it's a difficult life, 5 to 7 years, and a lot of people don't survive, as I had already mentioned. And a lot of these indentured servants don't end up becoming landowners straight away once they are released from their indenture, once they're effectively free people. Many of them don't become landowners ever, period. They become laborers. They become laborers on farms. They become laborers in towns. They might maybe open up a business, although that's fairly uncommon from my understanding. It's kind of bleak for a lot of these people once they do get out of indenture. It certainly is not what they hoped or imagined it might be once they're freed. And what's going on in Virginia is illustrative of this. There are Virginians on the frontier who have been released from their indenture, and they want land. And they're looking out at this frontier land where natives have rights according to treaties signed with the government in Jamestown. And these freed indentured servants, they want that land. And they want their government to help them get it. They want to launch an attack against Native Americans and take their land so that they can own it. However, Governor William Berkeley of Virginia is not on board with that as a plan. He does not want to see these Virginians attack the Susquehannock Native Americans or any other tribes that are in the area because, number one, it's pretty peaceful. Things are settled. There's not an armed conflict going on. And that's kind of the last thing he or a lot of other people in power want. And number two, Berkeley himself profits pretty significantly from the trade in deerskins with some of these Native Americans, and he does not want to disrupt that. So there's a couple of different reasons why Berkeley and some other wealthy, more well-off Tidewater region, those are the people that are out closer to the coast, they don't want the status quo disrupted. So they say, no, we don't want you guys to go out and attack these Native Americans. From the perspective of these former indentured servants out on the frontier, the Berkeley government is corrupt. And there's something to that. It does, as many of these colonial governments, and as I've talked about a few different times, the government in England does, it favors certain people with land grants, with loans, with licenses to hunt or to grow things or to trade or whatever. And there's a lot of poverty among these former indentured servants. And it just gets worse from the middle of the 1600s to this time, about 1675-76. These former indentured servants are feeling pretty desperate. So along comes this guy named Nathaniel Bacon. And he's a recent immigrant, a little more well-off than a lot of these former indentured servants, but he is sympathetic to them, and probably more importantly, he's hostile to Berkeley and to Berkeley's allies. So Bacon leads a massacre against the Occaneechi, I believe it is, Occaneechi Indians. I'm going to post a picture of that in the chat like I did with some other things from the last episode. They launched this attack against the Occaneechi Indians and are successful. Being kind of high on their success, that initial attack against the Native Americans to get their land evolves into snowballs, I guess you could say, into a rebellion against the government in Jamestown. And those who are not a part of Berkeley's inner circle, and a lot of these indentured servants, launch this really dramatic attack against a lot of the wealthy landowners, and eventually against Jamestown itself. Small farmers, landless men support Bacon's call for removal of natives, lower taxes, and an end to this rule by a cabal of elites that surround Berkeley. Jamestown is eventually attacked. It's burned to the ground, most of it. But Bacon dies suddenly in the midst of all of this. And there's a fleet of warships that comes in from England when the government in England learns of all of this chaos that is going on, and the rebellion falls apart. Bacon's dead, so nothing can really be done to him, but 23 of his associates are hanged as a demonstration of why this was wrong and what will happen to those who maybe follow in the footsteps of these indentured servants. And this is an important turning point. Number one, it's important because it's the first instance of a popular uprising, of a populist uprising in American history, and it's the first of many. A populist uprising, to be clear, is just the idea that a group of people are taking part in a mass movement that they feel is justified by the fact that the circumstances are not just to them and to most people in their town, city, state, what have you. Populist uprisings and populist movements are a common thing. You'll hear a lot of people referred to as populists. You know, there were political candidates recently. Donald Trump is sometimes referred to as kind of a right-wing populist, and there's something to that. This is important for that reason. It's maybe even more important because of what Bacon's rebellion ultimately does to shift the way that colonial society, particularly in the South, is organized and the way that the labor system works. That's sort of the big long-term impact of Bacon's rebellion. The next thing I'm going to talk about has to do with that. It's slavery, which I've mentioned, but haven't really gone into a lot of detail about, mostly because I was always going to get into it here, but also because, as I mentioned in previous episodes, it's simply not that big of a factor in 17th century American colonies. There just aren't that many slaves, period. Indentured servants are far more common, and if you recall, that's because indentured servants are cheaper and less risky as an investment to solve the labor problems of wealthy plantation owners. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. But Bacon's rebellion ties to slavery because it convinces a lot of wealthy plantation owners, big businessmen, merchants, and so forth, that indentured servants are not a good solution to the labor problem of these agricultural colonies. If you employ these indentured servants, eventually you have to let them go. And what very well could happen, as demonstrated by Bacon's rebellion, is that maybe they come to be so miserable that they organize together as a group and engage in some kind of massive uprising that totally upends your society. Because indentured servants maybe find out that life isn't automatically fantastic after your indenture is over. That it's tough to get land, and that the system will still advantage wealthy landowners. So a lot of the wealthy landowners, who also incidentally have an outsized voice in the government of these colonies, come to the conclusion that maybe doing the indentured servant thing isn't great for the long-term future of what we want to do here. That's a piece of what pushes these plantation owners toward chattel slavery and away from indentured servants as a solution to their labor problem. The other reason that chattel slavery becomes a more viable option in the minds of these big plantation owners is that mortality rates have fallen significantly. I mentioned this in the previous episode that maybe the biggest single reason that slaves were not a big part of the population, were not imported on a large scale to any of the 13 colonies in the 1600s, is that they weren't seen as a good long-term investment because they could die. The mortality rates were really high for just about everybody in the original colonies in the 1600s, and if you're a business owner, you don't want to invest a lot in an asset that may evaporate, may just no longer be there. So it was cheaper and therefore smarter, given the danger to anyone surviving for a number of years in this environment, to just bring indentured servants over. And whatever happens to them, cool. You're not that much. And again, it's a callous way to look at it. It's hard for me to even say it, but I try to think of the way that they look at it and the way that they thought about it. And that's pretty much what they were thinking. After Bacon's Rebellion and after the mortality rate begins to fall, you see a lot more African slaves beginning in the late 1600s, after Bacon's Rebellion, which is in 1675-76. Also, for a few different reasons, it gets harder to just bring over indentured servants, period. The economic conditions in England improved significantly in the later 1600s, and that means that people are less motivated to get out of England and go across the ocean to North America. I mean, that's already a pretty daunting undertaking for a lot of people, to leave everything and everyone they've ever known, probably never to come back again, just for the opportunity of a better circumstance. And if they can avoid that, and if they can find themselves in a decent circumstance economically back in England, they're going to stay. And a lot of them did in the later 1600s. Indentured servitude just wasn't as appealing then as it had been earlier in the century. There's also greater competition for bringing over slaves. The Royal African Company, which had been chartered in 1672, lost its monopoly on the slave trade to the colonies, and thus there were others who found a reason to get involved in the slave trade because they could actually compete now. And it was potentially a very good business to be in from a standpoint of making money. Obviously reprehensible to our modern senses. Slavery became, on top of all of that, once it was instituted and once it became more common, a lot more permanent, a lot more inflexible, a lot more race-based in English North America than it would become in Latin America. I think that's partially because it got established later in North America than it did in Latin America, where the vast majority of African slaves ended up. Most African slaves, there was something like 10 to 12 million African slaves imported from Africa to the New World over the course of about 400 years. The vast majority of them went to sugar-producing areas of the Western Hemisphere, and those are almost entirely in Latin America. Florida and Louisiana would later become sugar producers, but that's not till later. Most of the sugar production goes on in the West Indies, in Central America, in Brazil. And that's where most African slaves end up. And because of that, there's a lot more of them there. People there get a little more accustomed to them earlier on. And the lines are a little more fluid, I think, in part because of that. And I've already discussed in previous episodes the fact that there was intermarriage between people of African ancestry and people of European ancestry, and that did not automatically mean for those people of mixed European and African ancestry that they would be the equivalent of slaves or anything like it. There were, in fact, slave-owning Africans in Latin America and slave-owning people of mixed ancestry, European and African, in Latin America, and probably Native American and African. So those lines weren't quite as clear. Now, I mean, again, the vast majority of people of African ancestry who ended up in the New World were in the 16, 17, 1800s slaves. So it's not as though African slave owners were a huge percentage of the population or anything, but at least it was kind of possible. The laws passed in the North American colonies do make it more or less impossible for that to happen. Things change a little bit over time, but in large part, these laws are put in place to keep white people over here and African people over here. European descended people over here and African descended people over here. That's how they work. So, for example, the first law restricting slaves was passed in Virginia in 1662, and it had to do with slave children, essentially stating that children of slaves and non-slaves would most likely end up having the status of slaves. And that was to discourage white people from having children with people of African ancestry, especially slaves. Maryland passes the Act Concerning Negroes and Other Slaves of 1664. That act stipulates that, quote, all Negroes and other slaves, end quote, imported there, quote, shall serve durante vita, end quote. And durante vita means for life, okay? So there's just no possibility, according to this law, that slaves imported there will ever be freed. And it also targets the marriage of white women to black men. Free women, if they were to marry a black man or a slave, could become slaves themselves. And that law is obviously there to keep the races separated and to, put people of African ancestry on a lower rung of the social ladder than white people. By 1700, black people were more than 10% of the population of Virginia. So bigger than it was, but still relatively small. By 1750, people of African ancestry were almost 50%. So that shows kind of where things had been in the 1600s, that it was a little over 10%, and explodes really from 1700 to 1750 to the point where black slaves were, or anybody of African ancestry, was 50% of the population. The House of Burgesses passes slave code laws that sews together all of the separate existing slave laws and embeds white supremacy really in the entire colonial code of law. So you see where all this stuff is going. It is trying to create a separate sphere for European descended people over here, African descended people over here. And look, all 13 colonies had slavery. Now, certainly, slavery has a greater impact in a colony like Virginia, like South Carolina, like Maryland, where there are plantations and the vast majority of African descended people who are slaves end up as laborers, agricultural laborers on plantations. That's the fate of most of them. However, that does not mean that though the vast majority of them end up as agricultural labor on plantations, that there are not slaves in households in Massachusetts or as dock workers in New Hampshire or as carriage drivers, let's say, in New York City, where New York had a pretty significant population of slaves, from what I've read. So every colony has slavery. I think it's also important to point out that a lot of the New England colonies and mid-Atlantic colonies, though they had far fewer slaves than the southern colonies, benefited a great deal from slavery, either by being a part of the slave trade or by exporting and selling and making money off of the crops that are produced on these plantations by slave labor. So it's really impossible to separate the colonies of the United States and the United States as an independent country from slavery. It's had a dramatic impact that continues into the present. And, okay, here I'm going to get probably a little emotional, okay? Because part of the reason that I'm into history is that I consider myself to be a humanist. I'm somebody that cares deeply about the lives and the thriving and the happiness, potentially, and the justice of human societies to individual human beings. And when I hear people talk about slavery in a romantic fashion of any kind, it pisses me off. Because it is sheer ignorance at best. And it's probably hateful racism more likely. Anybody who ever suggests that slavery was anything other than horrific doesn't know what the fuck they're talking about. Because there is not one sensible human being on the planet who would trade places with an African slave at any point in U.S. history, colonial or independent U.S. history, for all the money in the world, if they knew what it was really like. Okay? You're talking about a group of people who had no legal rights whatsoever, who could be beaten at will, who could be starved at will, who could be sexually exploited at will, and had no recourse to do anything about it. There are literally beasts of burden and household pets that are treated far better than these human beings were treated for centuries. And the physical abuse and the sexual abuse and the deprivation, keeping them in cold quarters with barely adequate clothing, the humiliation of constantly being reminded that you are less than, and that you are disposable, and that you are an afterthought in the minds of the people who supposedly own you, is worth thinking about on its own. And all the data that is available shows what an awful life this was. I hear people sometimes say things were better off for black folks when they were slaves, which, I mean, again, immediately kind of sets me off, but it just also tells me that this person has no idea what they're talking about, because even a cursory examination of the facts says that that's not true. Life expectancy of slaves was far lower than it was for non-slaves. Runaways were a constant issue, because who the hell wouldn't try to get out of that situation? Though the consequences for running away were very severe on their own. There's all kinds of evidence of attempts to poison owners. There's, of course, slave uprisings. There are many instances written about where there are work slowdowns and sabotaging and all kinds of things that are ways in which enslaved people expressed resistance to the institution and to their situation. There's just all kinds of ways in which I have heard people over the past 20 years or so talk about slavery flippantly, glibly, and express that people of African ancestry were more servile and needed to be taken care of, all of which is horribly racist, and all of which is utter bullshit. And I really wish that every single American would just read one good book or watch one really good documentary about the life of slaves in this country to see what it was actually like. You wouldn't wish it on your worst enemy. It was awful. I hope everybody takes that away from this if they don't take anything else away from it. And not to mention the fact that slaves could be separated from their families like that, and they had no recourse whatsoever. You know, pregnant mothers must have been terrified of when the baby was born and how soon the baby might be taken away. Or husbands and wives separated from each other, brothers and sisters separated from each other, whenever the owners deemed it in their financial interest or otherwise. There is some degree of difference of what slavery was like depending on the colony, depending on the kind of plantation. There's diversity in terms of the day-to-day lives of slaves and what they did and how they labored and those sorts of things. It didn't mean that, like, a slave situation was ever great or even good. But just like there's variance among employers and bosses, there were slave owners who were on the really bad end of the spectrum and slave owners who were on the less terrible end of the spectrum. There were slaves that could sometimes earn money and have a little bit more independence to do their jobs as they saw fit. They weren't overseen every second of every day, but that's kind of the exception rather than the rule. Slave revolts, last thing I'll mention about this really dark, kind of depressing topic. Slave revolts occurred in New York City in 1712. As I said, that there was a pretty significant population of slaves there right up through independence. Louisiana In 1731, there's a big slave rebellion, and the Stono Rebellion may be the best known of the 18th century in 1739 to 41 in South Carolina. And some of the slaves who actually made it out of that migrated down to Florida and were taken in by the Spanish and actually came to defend St. Augustine from English soldiers. After the Stono Uprising, there is, much like what occurs in Salem, there's kind of a slave panic that ensues. And all of these laws that I've already mentioned about slaves congregating in groups together or interacting with non-slaves, with white people, they get stricter. And the separation gets that much more dramatic. Moving on from slavery, there's another important thing that I mentioned in one of the questions that I asked, and that is what is known as salutary neglect, also known as benign neglect. And of course, we don't generally associate the word neglect with anything positive, which is why it's kind of weird to hear words like salutary or benign on the other side of neglect. But in this case, viewed from the colonist perspective, it is a good thing. And what salutary neglect or benign neglect refers to is the period roughly from the Glorious Revolution, which starts again in 1688, and the beginning of the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, which starts in 1754 in North America. And during that period, what is going on is that Britain, England, isn't really paying any attention to the colonies. And that, from their point of view, is largely a good thing. Because as you would have picked up from the previous part of this episode, the colonists preferred to be left alone. And when the English got involved, it was generally in ways that the colonists didn't really appreciate. Taxing them more, telling them what to do in a more direct, in a closer, in a more strident fashion. And that's not something the colonists tended to appreciate. A lot of them went thousands of miles away from England so they could do their own thing and tell England to fuck off. Well, that's not really what you're getting if the English are doing things like putting together the Dominion of New England. So, once the Glorious Revolution occurs, England is a little too busy with its own stuff to worry about what is going on in the colonies. It's preoccupied with putting itself back together, with arranging a new form of government, effectively, not entirely new, but different from what had been. On top of the fact that the British are kind of putting themselves back together again, British North America, the 13 colonies, is not nearly as interesting, and it never really was, to the English, to anybody in any kind of position of power, compared to the sugar-producing colonies of the West Indies. Those are far more interesting to the English because they are the big moneymakers. Sugar is like the cash crop of the 17th and 18th centuries. And it is something that makes a lot of money for a lot of people, and thus the British care a lot more about the places that produce it, which is not the original 13 colonies. There are some weak, half-hearted attempts at reining in the colonies and the colonists' behavior, but as I've said, they are weak and half-hearted. There's the Molasses Act of 1733, which is explicitly designed to stop trade between New England and the French Caribbean islands like Haiti through high taxes on French molasses. Generally speaking, the colonists just ignored this stuff. Okay, especially the Molasses Act. They just said, whatever, good luck. Try enforcing that. It's like a highway that has a 60 mile per hour speed limit and there's no cops out there to actually give anybody tickets or pull anybody over. There are restrictions on manufacturing through the Wool Act, which, again, according to the whole mercantilism philosophy, the British government wants to dominate manufacturing and does not want the colonies to compete with them on manufacturing. So the Wool Act and the Hat Act The Wool Act is 1699. The Hat Act is 1732. There's the Iron Act of 1750. They all sought to give Britain a monopoly on those goods, which are all manufactured goods. The laws were, as was the Molasses Act, mostly ignored. The colonies printed paper money despite there being objections from Britain. Parliament and so forth, they didn't want the colonies to print money because there's the danger of inflation. That's one reason. Another reason is controlling the currency gives Britain, the British government, way more control. But from the colonist point of view, that makes things very difficult. It makes conducting business difficult. It makes doing just basic buying and selling of things difficult in communities, because a lot of the currency, especially stuff like silver or gold coins or bars or bricks or whatever, that is very commonly used as cash all over the place, that stuff oftentimes is used to pay off debts to banks in England or in other places in Europe. And it's also used to buy important staples or manufactured goods. So it leaves the colonies pretty quickly. And that makes it very difficult to do business between colonies or for just average people to buy and sell things. Now, bartering is still pretty common at this point, which is to say trading goods and services for goods and services rather than paying for things in cash. But it still makes a lot of things very complicated. And so that is one area in which the colonists push back quite a bit, is their ability to create and use their own forms of currency. One of the other kind of difficulties is that there's a stark contrast between the way that the upper classes in the colonies conduct themselves and the way that they relate to the mother country of Britain, England, and the way that the lower and middle classes, such as they were — middle class isn't really much of a thing at this point in history, much of anywhere. The people in the upper classes, they tend to more commonly associate themselves as being British or being English. And they want to kind of occupy the same place in the colonies that they would have back in Europe, back in England. So they tend to think of themselves more as being English, where the working classes and the middle classes tend to think of themselves as being something a little different. Now, that's not to say that there were not people from the middle and working classes who thought of themselves as English. There were. Or Scottish. Or Irish. There were. But as a general rule, I think it's pretty safe to say that the upper classes had more of an attachment to Britain, England, than the lower and middle classes did. And that proves to be important as we move more and more toward the era of revolution. On top of the fact that there are a lot of people who are actually English that are not terribly attached to England, and that there are a lot of Scottish people who are not terribly attached to Scotland, and there are a lot of Irish people who are not terribly attached to Ireland, there are a lot of other peoples from other nations of Europe and from places that are not European that are not attached to England at all. You've got in the colonies at this time, as we've already discussed, Dutch and Swedes and Frenchmen from the colonizing entrees or efforts of those countries. And from beyond that as well, you've got people that came straight from the Netherlands or from France or from Sweden to the United States. Smaller numbers, but they were there. And then there's German immigrants, which there's a pretty substantial number of German immigrants at this time. Now, there is no Germany per se at this point. Germany doesn't become an actual nation state until 1870. But there are German states, okay? And people who come from there to the American colonies. There's also Jewish immigrants. Not, again, a ton of them, but they are there. There are Slavs. There are also Native Americans and people of African ancestry who incorporate themselves in various ways into a lot of these colonial societies. Now, again, there's a bit of a wall, there's more than a bit of a wall. There's a substantial barrier separating Native Americans from European peoples in a lot of these colonies. As I've said before, they didn't intermingle as much as Europeans and Native Americans did in, say, the Spanish colonies or in some of the French colonies. But there were definitely some Native Americans who, for whatever reason, found themselves ingratiated into colonial society. And there were African slaves who had no attachment really to England, and then free Africans, and not a large number of them certainly, but they existed. And none of those people, Germans, French, Swedes, Native Americans, certainly Africans, had much of any kind of attachment to England or to Scotland or to Ireland or to Wales or to the UK in general. So there is this way in which not only are people who came from England or from Scotland or from Wales or from Ireland not super attached to England, but there's all these people in the colonies that have almost no attachment to England. And I hope you kind of see where I'm going with this, which is that it's why there's this sort of unique American character that develops that is independent of anything really associated with England or Scotland or Ireland or the UK. And this uniquely American identity becomes stronger and stronger as the 18th century goes along. And it was already even there in the 17th century. As we've mentioned, there were any number of people who came to what would be the original 13 colonies who had a kind of fuck Britain attitude. And that could have been for religious dissent purposes. That could have been because they didn't like the political system. It could have been for any number of reasons. Could have been because they were just poor people who felt like they were thrown away, which there's some legitimacy to that, as we've already discussed. Another big event that I want to talk about is the First Great Awakening. It's the first of two. There's one that happens later on when the United States is an independent country, which I will get to eventually. The First Great Awakening, the awakening part refers to a religious awakening. And you might say, well, isn't all of New England basically a largely religious community? Aren't there already religious associations with places like Virginia and the Church of England? And you would be correct. But as time goes along, for various reasons, those associations begin to wane. And the Great Awakening is I guess more of a reawakening, an emergence of religious importance and a diversification of religion in the colonies. There is, and the first thing I would mention when I talk about the Great Awakening in terms of what makes it what it is, what causes it to occur, is the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment, if you are not familiar, was an intellectual movement and a philosophical movement that has its origins really in the Glorious Revolution in England. And I think of the Enlightenment as occurring from essentially the Glorious Revolution to the French Revolution. So that's almost exactly a century. Depending on which historians you listen to or read, they'll have differing definitions of when exactly it occurs. But that's the definition that makes the most sense to me based on what I know about it. And this intellectual philosophical movement really focuses on government and society and ethical and moral behavior of government and society and how government institutions and societal institutions should operate. What role should religion play in a society? How much religious freedom should people have? Are monarchs the best way to do governance, or is there a better way? And I think probably the best summation of what the Enlightenment is in the simplest possible way is what a very important figure of the Enlightenment named Immanuel Kant, who's a part of the German Enlightenment, said. He kind of summarized the Enlightenment as dare to know. And that's what a lot of these Enlightenment era thinkers did. They debated each other, they challenged each other, they wrote pamphlets, they wrote long letters to each other, and it's figures from this movement that we associate as being influential on the American Revolution, because they were, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, although he's a little bit later. Probably more like John Locke, and Thomas Hobbes, and Baron de Montesquieu, and Denis Diderot, and Voltaire. Those are all famous figures of the Enlightenment. And they thought about and wrote about different sorts of things, but all kind of related to how society should work and what they should do to benefit humankind, and Are we doing things as best as we can, or can we make, the key word of the Enlightenment is progress? Can we move forward? Can we make human society and human beings maybe better? But there is kind of I would say that there is kind of an anti-religious bent to the Enlightenment, at least organized religion. Now, not every Enlightenment figure was vehemently opposed to organized religion or even not very religious. There were definitely figures of the Enlightenment that were religious, but there were a number of figures within the Enlightenment, and immediately Voltaire comes to mind, who were harsh critics of organized religion and who thought that it was foolish and that it was used to manipulate people. And like every philosophical movement or every social or political movement that has ever emerged on the planet, as far as I know, there is a backlash to this one, to the Enlightenment. And that's the first thing that I think of when I think of the Great Awakening, is that it is a backlash against the secularism and the sort of hostility to religion of the Enlightenment. That's how I kind of think of the origins of the Enlightenment. There was a strengthening fundamentalist Protestantism that developed simultaneous to, by the way, Wahhabism, which is a fundamentalist form of Islam in Saudi Arabia, and Hasidism, which is a fundamentalist form of Judaism in Poland and Eastern Europe. They all kind of come about at the same time, and they're all kind of a reaction in some way to the Enlightenment. Clergy in many Puritan areas, even some Anglican and Presbyterian areas, felt their flocks, their community of believers, had strayed from religion because of the rationalism of the Enlightenment, westward expansion, focus on commerce, making money, and just worldly pursuits. A lot of these very religious communities that we've talked about when we talk about these Puritan colonies, right? Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, New Haven, they had kind of started to stray from their religious foundation in the view of many clergy members and in the view of many people who were members of those communities. A series of revivals takes place throughout the colonies in the 1730s, which is, I think of the Great Awakening as happening in the 1730s, 40s, 50s. They weren't really centrally organized, these revivals. They just kind of happened. They were spearheaded by certain preachers. There are a few famous names that I will mention. These revivals are characterized more by passionate, emotional, religious experiences, less intellectual or instructive, didactic, if you want to say it in a fancy way, or dominated by elites. And in fact, the Great Awakening is kind of marked, as are many American intellectual popular movements, by a rejection of elites. You hear that a lot now in politics if you're paying attention. Okay, is that the elites, oh my God, what do they know? They're full of it. They're a bunch of eggheads and they're out for themselves. And that's like a really common refrain throughout American history. And this is maybe one of the first places where it starts. I mean, I think you can sort of squint and see elements of that in Bacon's Rebellion, which I talked about a few minutes ago. But this is definitely the case. These are not mostly well-educated people descended from great influential families who are leading this movement. Okay, this is mostly fairly common people without a lot of great family ties to old families that have dominated the political sphere in Europe and in the Americas for a very long time. It's very democratic in that way, and highly emotional in the sense like it's evangelism, right? It's this passionate, emotional experience that if you go to evangelical Christian communities today, you still see that stuff. It's quite prominent. You don't have to look too hard in the United States today to find a lot of evangelical Christians. So this movement is really kind of originated by a New Jersey Dutch Reformed theologian named Theodore Frelinghuysen. And there are Presbyterians named William and Gilbert Tennant, as well as a mass Congregationalist, probably the most famous figure in this movement, Jonathan Edwards, who originated this style and who would go out into fields like George Whitefield and these other folks, and preach to these big crowds of people who would get all wrapped up in the movement and wallow on the floor and on the ground and speak in tongues. George Whitefield actually arrives from England in 1739, and from 2 years, from 1739 to about 1741 too, he preached from Georgia all the way up to New England. Whitefield insisted that people were not predestined for damnation, but could save themselves by repenting and accepting the grace of Jesus Christ. So this sounds very much like evangelical Christianity today to me. Whitefield was something of a celebrity. I mean, not even something of a celebrity. I mean, people would flock to see this guy. I've read firsthand accounts, primary sources, of people saying that they dropped what they were doing and they rode their horses as fast as they could because they heard George Whitefield was going to be around. It's like the modern day equivalent of Taylor Swift or something. I'm not kidding. And maybe that sounds weird to us now, but that's what it was. Of course, this movement didn't emerge without criticism. No movement ever does. There gets to be this division between what are called Old Light and New Light Christians. And the Old Light are the more intellectual, more stoic, more emotionally staid preachers who don't like all of this caterwauling and, oh, thank you, Jesus, and, oh, the Lord has saved you, and all that kind of stuff. They want to keep things more, in their view, dignified. And they think that this is a lot of theatrics and nonsense. Okay, but the New Lights, they're the ones with the momentum. They're the ones drawing these big crowds in, and they kind of win a lot of people over. The Old Lights say that these people who are part of this movement are ignorant, they're not well educated, they don't respect the institutions and the highly intellectual versions of Christianity, but they got the numbers. And some of our most prominent sects or most prominent denominations in America today come out of this movement. There's the Baptist Church that comes out of this movement. There's the Methodist Church started by John Wesley. They both emerge and they help create this new standard of free religious worship and decrying state churches. So churches like the Church of England that are sponsored by the government and in close association with the government. And that's equally true of like the Congregationalist Church in, say, Massachusetts. The Great Awakening was the first spontaneous mass movement in U.S. history. It encouraged populist, grassroots thinking and shunned and criticized the elevated status of expertise and experts and educated elites, as I said before. And it's become a pretty common refrain throughout American history into the present. A couple other things I want to mention before we end this episode. Colonies became deeply entwined in the Atlantic economy during this time, which is to say that they started to interact a lot more with other parts of the New World and the Old World rather than just being straight up suppliers of raw materials to the British Isles. They became providers of raw materials to the West Indies, maybe most notably, which is, I mentioned this in the last episode, that the founders of the Carolina colony had in mind when they first founded it that they would provide raw materials to these sugar-producing colonies in the West Indies, and it came to fruition, ultimately. Philadelphia becomes the biggest port city and the biggest city, period, in the colonies. There is this massive migration from Scotland, Ulster, which is Northern Ireland, and Germany that massively increases the population of the colonies. So this massive migration of people from Scotland, Ulster, and Germany rapidly increases the population and contributes to the colonies becoming a real political and economic force in the not too distant future. Sometimes whole families from Germany would come as indentured servants. So all the family would sign up for indenture rather than just one single guy, which was the case in the 1600s a lot of the time. And these servants who came together as a family of indentured servants were called redemptioners a lot of the time. One of the most religiously, ethnically, and economically diverse places on the planet in the 18th century, not just in the Western Hemisphere, not just when you consider Europe or whatever, but in the entire planet was British North America, when you consider all these different groups coming together. So even back in the colonial days, we were something of a melting pot. Most migrants who came to British North America came for religious freedom, economic opportunity, and avoidance of war, conflict, and in particular, avoiding conscription, which is what we now call the draft. But conscription is just kind of a broad general term for being forced to join the military. And remarkably, or maybe not, considering the competition at the time, the standard of living is a lot better for people in the British North American colonies than it is for people in places all over Europe. And these European immigrants, they write back to their families about what it's like in the American colonies. And this kind of starts a pattern of what continues up to this day, people seeking out what will be the United States as a land of opportunity, because it really is. Even back in the colonial days, even back with all the restrictions they had there, it still was seen as a place that people could come and make their lives better. Pretty amazing, to me, at least, when you think about it. Okay, that's it for this episode. Thank y'all for listening. Thank y'all for hanging with me. I always appreciate it. If you have any comments, anything you want to share, I'd be delighted to hear all of it. If you want to check my facts, by all means, feel free to do so. Of course, please like and subscribe. Liking and subscribing really helps people to find the podcast. And if you like it, I'm sure your friends and family might also. You can contact me at howthehelldiwegetherepod@gmail.com, or you can reach me and leave a voicemail or a text or anything like that you would like at 951-525-5536. Feel free to leave a voicemail. Yell at me, make jokes at my expense, have a great old time. I got thick skin, I can deal with it. Thanks again for listening. Really appreciate y'all. Take care, and I will catch you next time.